You were the last kid who got yelled at to come home when the streetlights turned on, and you're also the first one who had to figure out a smartphone with zero instructions. Let's just sit with that for a second, because it's a weirder position to be in than people give us credit for. If you were born somewhere between 1977 and 1983, congratulations, you're a Xennial, and you basically got handed two totally different childhoods and told to make sense of both of them. Here's the number that stopped me cold when I first heard it. The average kid today spends less than 7 minutes a day in unstructured outdoor play. 7 minutes? You probably spent 7 minutes just walking to your friend's house before you even started playing. Back in 1985, most of us were getting 8, 9, 10 hours of totally unsupervised outdoor time in a single week. No phones, no tracking apps, no way for your mom to know exactly where you were unless you showed up for dinner. That's not a small shift. That's like comparing a kid who grew up in a national park to one who grew up in a parking garage. And that gap is exactly why Xennials think differently than everybody around us. We're not Gen X, even though we get lumped in there. Gen X came up angrier, more latchkey, more punk rock disillusioned because they watched their parents get burned by divorce rates and economic promises that never paid off. We got some of that energy, sure, but we also got this weird stretch of actual innocence before it all hit. And we're definitely not millennials, even though people try to slide us into that group too. Millennials grew up with technology baked into their childhood from the jump.
We had to watch it arrive. We remember the before and the after, and that distinction changes everything about how your brain gets wired. Think about what a normal Tuesday looked like for an 8-year-old Xennial. You got home from school, nobody was tracking your location, you grabbed your bike, you found your friends by literally riding around the neighborhood until you spotted them. And if a fight broke out, you worked it out face to face because there was no group chat to hide behind. If you wanted to talk to someone, you called their house phone and prayed their parents didn't answer first. And if they did, you had to be polite to an actual adult before you could even get to your friend. That's a social skill. That's not nothing. Kids today can literally avoid ever hearing a parent's voice if they're texting a friend. And we forget how much low-key bravery it took just to ask if your buddy could come out and play. Now, here's where the psychology part gets interesting, because this isn't just nostalgia talking. Developmental psychologists have been saying for years that unstructured play, the kind where nobody's refereeing and nobody's grading you, is where kids build actual risk assessment skills. You learn how far you can jump off a wall before it hurts. You learn how to read a room full of other kids and figure out who's actually your friend versus who's just there. You learn boredom, real boredom, the kind where you have to invent a game out of literally nothing because there's no screen to bail you out. That boredom is where creativity actually comes from. Kids who never experience it don't build that same muscle. And it's not their fault, it's just not the world they got handed. So Xennials got the last real dose of that. We got the boredom, we got the risk, we got the face-to-face conflict resolution. And then right as we were hitting our teenage years or early 20s, the entire world flipped underneath us. Dial-up internet showed up, and suddenly there was this screeching modem sound that somehow still lives in the back of everyone's brain. AOL Instant Messenger became a second language. And then cell phones went from a brick your dad kept in the car for emergencies to something every single person carried in their pocket within about a decade. We didn't grow up with this stuff. We adapted to it in real time, which is a completely different mental process than being born into it. That's actually the core of the whole psychological profile here. Adapting to something as a teenager or young adult forces your brain to consciously integrate new systems instead of just absorbing them as background noise. When you learn something as a baseline reality, you don't question it, you just live inside it. But when you watch a technology arrive and change your life in real time, you understand both what was lost and what was gained. That's why so many Xennials have this specific talent for translating between generations. We can talk to our parents, who still print out emails, and in the same afternoon, we can help configure a teenager's gaming setup. We're basically bilingual in analog and digital, and that's a rare skill that younger and older folks just don't have in the same way. There's also something to be said about how this shaped our relationship with attention itself. If you grew up without constant stimulation, you had actual practice sitting with silence, sitting with boredom, sitting with the mundane parts of a day without reaching for a device to fill the gap. That's not a moral high ground thing, it's literally a different neural pathway that got built early and stuck around. Studies on attention spans have shown a steady decline over the past 2 decades that lines up almost perfectly with increased screen exposure in childhood, and Xennials sit right on the edge of that curve.
Old enough to have built the old pathway, young enough to have adapted to the new demands too. And can we talk about how we experienced friendship? Because it mattered in a physical, inconvenient way. If you wanted to see your friend, you had to actually go over there. You had to ride your bike, or beg your mom for a ride, or walk. There was effort involved, and that effort meant something. It made the friendship feel earned instead of algorithmically suggested. Compare that to now, where a kid can have 300 followers and 0 people who'd actually show up if something went wrong. Xennials tend to keep smaller friend groups, but deeper ones, because that's the model we grew up inside. Quality over quantity wasn't a choice. It was just how connection worked back then. Even the way we handle failure is different. When you fell off your bike as a kid with no phone nearby, nobody filmed it, nobody posted it. You just got up, maybe cried a little, and kept going. There was no digital record of your worst moments following you around. That gave us room to mess up privately and recover without an audience. Kids growing up now don't always get that luxury, and it changes how willing you are to take a risk in the first place if you know failure might end up online forever. Now, I'm not saying it was all perfect, because it wasn't. We also grew up in an era where a lot of stuff just didn't get talked about. Mental health wasn't really a dinner table topic. If you were struggling, the answer was usually to walk it off or go outside, which sometimes worked and sometimes just meant kids suffered quietly because nobody had the language for what they were feeling. So there's a real trade-off here. We got the freedom and the boredom and the face-to-face connection, but we also got less emotional support and way fewer resources if something actually went wrong. Both things can be true at once. What's fascinating is watching Xennials raise their own kids right now, in 2026, because we're the generation trying to thread this needle on purpose. We know what unsupervised outdoor time gave us, so a lot of us are pushing our kids toward more independence, more boredom, more bike rides without a tracker on their wrist. But we also know what we didn't get growing up. So we're trying to actually talk about feelings at the dinner table instead of just changing the subject. We're basically running a live experiment, trying to combine the best parts of both worlds, because we're the only generation that's actually lived inside both of them long enough to know what's worth keeping. That's really the whole psychological signature of being a Xennial. We're translators. We're the last generation that remembers a world without constant connection. And the first generation that had to build the muscle to live inside one anyway. We didn't get eased into the future, we got dropped into it, and somehow we figured it out, because we already knew how to figure things out without instructions, without a search bar, without someone doing it for us first. Maybe that's the real inheritance. Not the cartoons, not the mixtapes, not the smell of a Blockbuster on a Friday night. It's that we learned how to build something out of nothing before we ever learned how to look something up. And that might end up being the most useful skill either generation around us never got the chance to develop. If this hit home and you're sitting there nodding like I just described your entire childhood, do me a favor and buy me a coffee through the link in the description. It genuinely helps keep this channel going, and every single coffee makes a difference. Thanks for being here.